Lightning over the well showed him exactly what the title of this night promised. A pale, enslaved woman, feared as a curse, and the stranger who would be asked to take her away before dawn. Stay with me, because what Cosme Alderete found at Hacienda Los Remedios was the first crack in a secret powerful people had buried for years. It was after midnight, in an October storm, when Cosme came up the muddy road from Jalapa, bent in the saddle, water dripping from the brim of his hat and running down the back of his neck. His mule was tired enough to stumble, and the wooden sample case at his side kept striking his hip with every uneven step. Inside were the goods that fed him: folded silks, fine damasks, ribbon lengths wrapped in paper, all of it bought in Veracruz and meant for customers farther inland. By then, he wanted no profit, no bargaining, no warm fire with wine. He wanted a roof, a dry corner, and the mercy of morning. Los Remedios rose out of the rain like a dark beast asleep. The tiled roofs shone black. Water spilled from the eaves in hard silver ropes. The yard had become a skin of mud, and the old stone well stood near the center like a blunt finger lifted toward heaven. Then the sky split again, white and violent, and there she was. She did not flinch. That was the first thing that unsettled him. A young woman stood by the well as still as carved bone, her dress soaked through, her loose hair bright and thin under the storm, almost silver where the lightning caught it. Her skin was pale as candle wax, startling against the dark yard, and the rain ran down her face without changing her expression. She might have been 20, perhaps a little more. She might have been a ghost, if ghosts breathed. Cosme drew the mule up short. For one heartbeat he wondered whether tiredness had made a fool of his eyes. But no, the woman blinked against the rain. Her hands were real. Her shoulders trembled once, very slightly, from cold. "Señora," he called over the downpour, "you'll die standing there. Is there shelter?" At that, she turned her face toward him fully. Her eyes were very light, strange only because they held no panic. What they held was something older, the look of a person who has long since learned what people see before they see her. "You should not speak to me," she said. Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the rain. Cosme swung one leg down and landed in mud up to the ankle. "Why not?" "Because they say I bring misfortune. Crops fail, babies sicken. Men who take pity on me regret it." He almost laughed, though not at her. That sounds like something said by people who need someone weaker than themselves to blame. For the first time, something flickered in her face. Not trust. Trust was too rich a thing for that moment. It was surprise, perhaps even offense, because simple kindness can wound when the world has taught you to expect a trick behind it. Another flash lit the yard. He saw then that her hands were empty. No shawl, no shoes worth naming, no bundle. Only the drenched cloth clinging to her arms and the thin rise and fall of her breathing. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated before answering, as if the true one had not been used often enough to sit easily on her own tongue. "Mariama." Then, after a pause, "At this place they call me the White One, or the Marked One." If you like long, candlelit stories like this, subscribe and stay with me. Cosme opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, a lantern glow moved beneath the arcade of the main house. Boots crossed the wet stones. A man in a dark cloak stepped into the yard and looked from the merchant to the woman by the well. And in that single look, Cosme understood that the storm was not the worst thing waiting for him at Los Remedios. The man who stepped into the yard carried his authority the way some men carry a whip without needing to raise it. The lantern in his hand threw a yellow ring over the rain, over the churned mud, over Mariama's wet hair clinging to her shoulders. He was past middle age, broad through the chest, wrapped in a dark riding cloak that smelled faintly of wet wool and tobacco. His face had the heavy calm of a landowner, used to being obeyed before he finished speaking. This was Don Aurelio Quintanar de Loaiza, master of Hacienda Los Remedios, and when his eyes settled on the young woman by the well, there was no surprise in them at all. Only weariness, and something like opportunity. "Well," he said, looking at Cosme first, never at her for long, "the storm has brought me a merchant." Cosme took off his hat out of courtesy, rain spilling from the brim. "Cosme Alderete, señor. I travel with cloth from the coast." "I was hoping only for a dry corner until daylight." "You shall have it," Aurelio replied. "No Christian man leaves a traveler out in weather like this." The words were polite. The tone beneath them was not. It had that smoothness rich men use when they are already measuring what else the night might yield them. His gaze slid back to Mariama. "And I see you've already met the trouble of this house." She lowered her eyes at once. It was the movement of someone long trained to become smaller when named aloud. The rain tapped on the well stones. Somewhere under the arcade, a restless horse struck wood with its hoof. Cosme felt his jaw tighten. "I met a woman standing in a storm." Aurelio let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh. "If only it were that simple." He stepped closer, boots sinking softly into the mud. "You are new here, Señor Alderete. You do not know what people say. Since this creature came into the world, calves have been born weak, maize has blackened in the field, and mothers have crossed themselves over empty cradles. My workers whisper that she draws misfortune like a bell draws sound." Mariama did not look up, but Cosme saw her fingers curl inward, pressing against her own palms until the knuckles whitened. "The ignorant always need a body to hang their fear upon," he said quietly. That answer made Aurelio study him more carefully, not angrily, carefully, as if a stubborn mule had shown unexpected teeth. "You are a practical man, I hope," the hacendado said. "You sell silks and damasks. You know what has value, and what becomes too costly to keep." He lifted the lantern slightly toward Mariama. "She works. She is strong. Yet no household wants her near. My people call her the White One, the Marked One. They would sooner sleep beside a snake." For the first time, Mariama's face changed. Only a little. Shame was there, yes, but behind it lived an older exhaustion, the sort that comes when even insults have grown familiar. Aurelio's voice softened in a way that made it crueler. "Take her with you when you leave." Cosme stared at him, certain he had heard badly through the rain. "What?" "I'm giving her to you. A gift, if you like. One less mouth under my roof. One less cause for murmuring among the peons." "If she serves you well, then fortune has smiled on us both." The storm seemed to draw one long breath around them. Water dripped from the mule's ears. The lantern flame shivered in the wind. Mariama stood as still as before, but something in that stillness had changed. She was listening the way condemned people listen, not because they hope to be heard, but because their future is being spoken over them. Cosme looked from her to the man who owned the yard, the house, the soaked earth beneath their feet. He had seen enslaved people bought and sold before. Any man who traveled enough roads had. But there was something foul in the ease of this offer, something that smelled worse than the mud and wet straw around them. It was a disposal. "I do not buy people," Cosme said. Aurelio shrugged one shoulder. "Then do not buy. Accept. Carry her past my gate, and she is your concern instead of mine." At that, Mariama finally lifted her face. Her eyes moved to Cosme's with a look so guarded it almost hurt to meet. She was not pleading. She had learned better than pleading. She was bracing herself for the shape of a stranger's mercy. And above them, behind the curtain of rain, on the upper gallery of the main house, another figure had come to stand unseen by Aurelio. A woman, holding the balustrade so tightly, her white fingers shone in the dark. For a moment, nobody in that rain-lashed yard moved. The lantern hissed softly where drops struck the metal top, and the light shivered over Aurelio's face. Mariama stood between the well and the stranger's mule, as if the whole world had narrowed to those few paces of mud. Cosme felt the wet leather of his gloves sticking to his palms. He could have refused. He could have taken the shelter, slept till dawn, and ridden away with his silks and damasks untouched by another family's darkness. Men did that every day. They called it prudence. Instead, he said, "If she leaves with me, she leaves as a free woman." Aurelio's brows rose only a little. The storm seemed louder after those words, as though the roof tiles themselves had heard them. "Free," he repeated, with faint amusement. "You speak as if a sentence could turn the world over." "A sentence can draw a line," Cosme answered. "Once she is past your gate, you will have no claim over her." Mariama's breath caught. It was a tiny sound, nearly lost under the rain, but he heard it. So did Aurelio. The hacendado studied him in silence. Then he gave a slow shrug, careless on the surface, though his eyes had sharpened. "Call her what you like once she is gone. Free, servant, pilgrim, burden, it makes no difference to me. From this night forward, she is no concern of Los Remedios." That was the cruelest part. He spoke as though he were dismissing a broken harness. Cosme turned to Mariama. "Do you wish to come away from here?" The question itself startled her more than the offer had. She lifted her head fully, rain gleaming along her lashes. No one had asked what she wished. That much showed plain as a wound. She looked first at Cosme, then at Aurelio, and finally toward the dark house behind them, as if some last chain might still jerk tight from an unseen hand. "I do not belong to my own wishes," she said at last. "You do tonight," Cosme replied. Something moved on the upper gallery, a skirt hem, a hand withdrawing from the balustrade. Whoever had been watching had stepped back into shadow. Aurelio made an impatient sound. "Enough. Tomas will open the side gate. She has nothing worth taking." That, too, proved untrue. A few minutes later, under the lean-to near the kitchens, where rain drummed on the tiles and the air smelled of damp firewood, an old cook pressed a tiny bundle into Mariama's hands without meeting anyone's eyes. 2 shifts of coarse cloth, a comb with missing teeth, and a small wooden crucifix darkened by years of touch. Mariama held it as if warmth might return through the grain. "It was your mother's," the cook murmured. "Hide it." At the word mother, Mariama's face changed in a way Cosme would remember for a long time. Pain came first, then restraint, then a stillness so practiced it frightened him more than tears would have. By the time the gate creaked open, the storm had weakened into hard slanting rain. The yard beyond the walls was a black ribbon of road, cut now and then by pale runoff. Cosme secured the sample case on the mule again, then turned and offered Mariama his hand. She stared at it a beat too long because she did. When she placed her cold fingers in his, he did not grip her like property or guide her like a child. He simply steadied her over the worst of the mud. Behind them, Aurelio called, "Take care, merchant! Men have lost more than sleep by showing kindness to that one." Cosme did not turn around. "Then let loss choose better company." They crossed the gate together. Mariama stopped just beyond the threshold. She looked back once at the hacienda walls, at the blind, dark windows, at the yard where lightning over the well had first placed them in one another's path. Then she touched the crucifix beneath her bundle and whispered, almost to herself, "I have never been beyond this road." Cosme adjusted the mule's reins. "Then we begin with the next mile." He meant it kindly, yet when he glanced at her he saw no relief on her face, only a wary disbelief that ran deeper than fear. She had survived too many forms of mercy twisted into use by other people. Above, from behind a shutter in the upper rooms, Doña Hortensia del Carmen watched the pair vanish into the rain, then turned at once and sent a servant running for the mayordomo. Before the road had swallowed them entirely, another scene was unfolding behind the shuttered rooms of Los Remedios. Doña Hortensia del Carmen did not descend to the yard. She withdrew from the window with her breath unsteady, one hand pressed hard against her chest beneath her dressing robe. The corridor outside her chambers smelled of lamp oil and wet plaster. Rain whispered along the roof tiles, softer now, though the storm had left the whole house trembling in its bones. A maid came at once when she rang, and the girl found her mistress standing by the table with both candles lit, though it was still the dead middle of night. "Send for Wenceslao," Hortensia said. The maid hesitated. "Now, senora?" "Now." There are many kinds of fear. The fear of thunder passes. The fear of illness bends a body and then loosens it again. What held Doña Hortensia that night was something narrower and sharper. It had memory in it. She was frightened of speech, of roads, of a face that might be seen too long by the wrong eyes. Wenceslao Otazio came from the mayordomo's quarters, still half-dressed for sleep, boots unlaced, coat thrown over his shirt. He had served the Quintanar family for more than 20 years, and long service had made him a man of still habits. His hair was threaded with gray. His face had the weathered look of someone who spent more hours among horses, tools, and field hands than under a proper roof. He closed the chamber door behind him and waited. Hortensia did not offer him a seat. "She has gone," she said. "I know, senora. Tomas told the guard the merchant took her through the side gate." "At whose order?" "At Don Aurelio's." A flicker of bitterness crossed her mouth. "My husband grows careless in his age." Wenceslao said nothing. He had long ago learned that silence was the safest cloth in which to wrap another person's anger. Hortensia stepped closer to him, lowering her voice, though no one else was in the room. "Listen carefully. The man must be followed before dawn, quietly. I want to know where he takes her, where he sleeps, who sees them, and whether she speaks." That last phrase made him raise his eyes. "Speaks of what, senora?" For the first time, something raw showed through her composure. "Do not ask foolish things of me tonight." He bowed his head slightly. "As you wish." She turned away, then back again, unable to keep still. Her fingers worried the edge of a rosary hanging from her waist. If she remains only a strange girl on the road, there is no danger. People stare, cross themselves, and go on. But if she falls among those who keep old records, if some priest with a memory, or some sacristan with idle hands, begins turning pages. Her words thinned out, and for a moment she seemed to be speaking to herself. "No, that cannot happen." Wenceslao's face gave nothing away, yet the room had changed. The rain outside was only rain, but inside those walls another weather had risen. He knew then that the talk of curses, spoiled harvests, and dead infants had always been useful smoke. Whatever the senora feared, it wore a human shape. "Do you want her brought back?" he asked. Hortensia looked at him so sharply that even he felt the force of it. "No." It was a small word, but it landed with a weight of iron. "She must be kept from questions," she said more carefully. "Do you understand me? Especially church questions. I will not have some wandering trader carry trouble from this house to Orizaba or farther. If the merchant is decent, frighten him. If he is stubborn, mislead him. But do not let that girl stand before anyone who writes names in books." Wenceslao stood very still. Somewhere in the house a window banged once in the wind. The maid outside shifted her feet and then went silent again. "At first light," he said, "I will take the bay horse." Hortensia nodded, but the strain in her face did not ease. She seemed to be looking past him now, past the room, past the walls of the hacienda, toward a road already dark with mud and dawn. Many miles ahead of that coming pursuit, Cosme and Mariama had found a ruined wayside shelter where the merchant thought only to wait out the last of the rain, unaware that behind them, a man who had witnessed the night of her birth was already tightening a saddle. The shelter they found before dawn had once been used by muleteers and charcoal burners, though now it was little more than 3 stone walls and a slanting roof patched with rotting palm. Rain still came through in thin threads. The floor smelled of damp earth, old ashes, and mule sweat left by travelers who had passed there in better seasons. Cosme tied his animal onto the driest edge, loosened the girth, and set his sample case on an upturned crate to keep the fabrics from wicking up moisture. Mariama remained standing near the doorway, the bundle clutched to her chest, watching every movement as if she were measuring the cost of each kindness before accepting it. "You may sit," he said. She glanced toward the farthest corner, then folded herself down carefully onto a low stone ledge. Even that small motion had the caution of habit. Her dress clung cold and heavy to her limbs. Rainwater still slipped from the ends of her hair and darkened the hem around her feet. Cosme opened his satchel and took out a heel of bread, a piece of white cheese wrapped in cloth, and a small knife. He cut the food in half and offered one portion across the space between them. "If we wait for the sun before eating, we'll both be fools." Mariama looked at the bread as though it might belong to someone else. "You owe me nothing, senor." "I did not say I owed you." He gave the faintest smile. "I said I was hungry." That, unexpectedly, made her eyes lift to his face. He saw then how young she still was beneath all that guardedness. Young and exhausted, clear through. She took the food at last. Her fingers brushed his hand only a moment, cold as well water. They ate in the broken shelter while the last of the storm muttered over the hills. Somewhere beyond the road, frogs had begun their rough morning singing. A wet wind brought the smell of cane fields and turned soil. After a while, Cosme said, "When I spoke at the gate, I meant it. No man has the right to claim you now." Mariama chewed slowly, swallowed, and kept her eyes on the doorway. "Words are light, senor. The world is heavy." He let that sit between them. It was too honest to answer quickly. Then, trying to ease the hard look in her face, he said, "For what it is worth, I do not think you carry misfortune. You appeared in the worst storm of the month, and yet I found shelter, a dry wall, and enough bread for two. That sounds more like favor than ruin. I would say—" He paused, almost embarrassed by his own thought. "I would say, you are good fortune." She turned to him sharply. It was alarm, a different kind from the one she had worn at the hacienda, but real enough. "Do not call me that." Cosme blinked. "I meant no offense." "I know you meant kindness." Her voice stayed low, but something inside it tightened. "That does not make it safe. People who fear a woman because they think she ruins things are dangerous. People who prize her because they think she changes fate can be worse. In both cases, she is no longer a person. She becomes a sign." Those words landed cleanly. Cosme stared at the crust in his hand for a moment, then nodded once. "You are right." She seemed almost surprised to hear it. "I am learning as I go," he said. "You'll have to forgive clumsy speech from a cloth seller who knows more of thread counts than of wounds." A breath that was nearly a laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It altered her whole face. Briefly, the wariness loosened. "My trade has one advantage," he added. "I know when a thing has been falsely named. Coarse cotton sold as silk, cheap dye passed for indigo. A curse the powerful invented may still frighten a village, but it remains a lie." That time she said nothing. She only lowered her gaze to the little wooden crucifix in her lap and ran her thumb across it once, as if touching the memory of a hand long gone. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. Gray light was gathering over the road. Cosme rose, rolled the food cloth, and looked at her bundle. "You left with almost nothing," he said gently. Mariama nodded. "Almost." Then, after a silence, she spoke so softly he nearly missed it. "When I was born, the women were so frightened of me. They wrapped me in rags and nearly let me go unfed." Cosme turned back toward her fully. In the pale morning that followed the storm, she began, for the first time, to tell him where her life had truly started. The gray light widened at the doorway while Mariama kept her eyes on the crucifix in her hands. "My mother came across the sea already carrying me," she said. "That is what the older women told me when I was old enough to ask and young enough to believe answers came clean." Her thumb moved over the worn wood. "They said the traders called her homeland Guinea, though to them, every coast beyond their knowing seemed to wear one name. She arrived sick from the voyage, with salt sores on her wrists, and a child moving beneath her ribs." Cosme listened without interrupting. Outside, the mule shook rain from its hide. A drop kept falling from the broken roof into the same dark patch of dirt, steady as a clock. "When my time came," Mariama went on, "the women who attended the birth saw my face, my hair, my color, and terror took hold of them before pity did. One crossed herself. Another said my mother had brought a judgment from over the water. They wrapped me in rags and set me aside while they argued whether I should be fed at all." Her voice did not tremble. That was what made it harder to hear. She spoke like someone laying out folded cloth, one plain piece after another, because making the story neat was the only way to touch it. "My mother fought them," she said. "That much I know. She had little strength left after the labor, but she fought. An old washerwoman used to say she dragged herself half off the pallet to reach me. She cursed them in her own tongue first, and in Spanish after, until at last one of them took fright of her, or of God, and brought me to her breast." Cosme lowered himself back onto the crate, elbows on his knees. He had spent years on roads, in inns, storehouses, kitchens, mule yards. He had heard men talk about bondage the way they talked about rain or taxes, as if it were simply part of how the earth had been arranged. Yet now, in that ruined shelter, he felt again how much evil survives by making itself sound ordinary. "Did your mother ever speak of your father?" he asked gently. Mariama gave a small shake of the head. "If she knew she carried it alone, or perhaps she feared what such knowledge would bring. At Los Remedios, too many names could hurt a person." The morning brightened enough for him to see her clearly now, skin pale as candle wax against the dim stone, lashes still dark from rain. Her face held traces of beauty that had likely brought her no comfort at all. Beauty, in a place like that, could become another kind of danger. "She died when I was 5, Mariama said. This time there was a pause before the words that followed. A real one. Breathing space for pain. "They said fever. Maybe it was. Maybe it was the years before it. Maybe it was grief that finally found a place to sit down inside her body." She looked toward the open road, though she seemed to be seeing another room entirely. "After that, no one woman claimed me outright. The field hands and kitchen women took me in by turns. One washed me. Another taught me to grind maize. Another hid me when boys from the stables thought frightening me was a sport. They raised me together, because kindness divided many ways draws less punishment than kindness seen too clearly in one pair of hands. Cosme exhaled slowly. "And the master's household. They let me live because I worked." Her mouth bent, not quite into bitterness, not quite into resignation. "I learned early to move fast, carry more than was asked, speak little, and never seem proud. Even so—" She stopped. "Even so what?" Mariama lifted her gaze to him at last. "Don Aurelio spoke of me as though I were rot in the walls. But his wife," her fingers tightened around the crucifix, "her fear was different. I knew that even as a child. Other people saw in me whatever tale they wanted. She looked at me as though she recognized something." A faint breeze passed through the doorway and stirred the loose hair at her temple. The storm smell was fading now, giving way to wet grass and the distant sweetness of turned cane. Cosme said nothing. He sensed that if he stepped too hard into this moment, she would fall silent again. Mariama swallowed once. "There is one thing I have never forgotten," she said softly. "I was 7, perhaps 8. I was outside the chapel wall, near enough to hear voices through the shutters. Doña Hortensia was inside with Father Anselmo, and I heard her say that God was punishing her with me. Cosme did not answer her at once. The words about Father Anselmo seemed to remain in the damp air of the shelter long after she had spoken them. Outside, the mist was lifting from the road in pale strips, and the first birds had begun to call from the brush. Mariama sat with the crucifix resting across both palms, as if she had laid before him the only shard of truth she possessed, and did not know whether he would treat it gently. "At 7 or 8, he said at last, "a child may misunderstand many things, but not fear. A child knows when someone is afraid of her." She looked at him then, sharply, because he had put his hand on the right thought without dressing it in pity. "Yes," she said, "that is what I remember. Not the priest's voice, not every word. Her fear." They left the ruined shelter once the road had turned from black to brown, and the clouds began to break apart over the hills. The land opened slowly as they climbed, wet leaves flashing in the early light, the earth dark and rich under the hooves of the mule. Cosme walked more often than he rode, partly for the animal's sake, partly because he did not want Mariama trailing behind him like baggage. By midday they could smell wood smoke from distant houses, and the sweeter breath of coffee drying somewhere beyond the folds of the land. He asked few questions after that. Mariama, for her part, seemed relieved by the silence. It was a companionable one now, though still delicate. She watched everything with the attentiveness of a person crossing out of one life and into another with each mile. Roadside crosses, women washing linen in the shallows of a stream, boys driving pigs through red mud, the blue distance of the mountains. Near afternoon, the road bent and widened, and beyond a line of poplars, the tiled roofs of Orizaba came into view. Mariama slowed. She had never seen so large a place. Bell towers rose above the houses. Smoke drifted in soft blue sheets from ovens and cook fires. Carts rattled over stone. The air held too many smells at once: hot bread, wet leather, horse dung, coffee, frying lard, damp wool drying in the sun. Men shouted prices. Women crossed streets carrying baskets against their hips. Dogs barked from under wagons and were cursed away by muleteers. Cosme glanced back at her. "Stay close to me. In a town, curiosity is quicker than malice, but it can still sting." She almost smiled at that, though uneasily. "You say it as if I should be grateful to be stared at by strangers instead of neighbors." "In this matter," he said, guiding the mule between two ox carts, "I think strangers may prove the kinder sort." He led her through a lane where cloth merchants and dyers kept their houses, and stopped before a broad doorway painted blue, its lintel darkened by years of weather. A servant boy admitted them into a cool inner patio where potted basil and rosemary sat in clay jars, filling the shade with a clean green smell. There, beneath a gallery strung with drying skeins of thread, stood Don Eligio Basaldua. He was an older man with a rounded back and thick white mustache, dressed plainly for one who handled costly goods. When he saw Cosme, his face opened at once. "You old road rat," he said, embracing him. "I had begun to think some mountain pass had swallowed you whole." Cosme laughed for the first time since the storm. It nearly did. Then Don Eligio noticed Mariama. His expression altered, though only for a heartbeat. Surprise first, then a merchant's caution. Then, to his credit, restraint. "And who travels in your company?" he asked. "A woman under my protection," Cosme answered. "She needs rest, dry clothing, and the courtesy of no questions for at least 1 hour." Don Eligio studied him, then gave a small nod. "That can be arranged." He clapped for the cook. A broad-hipped woman named Jacinta appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She looked Mariama over from head to toe, taking in the soaked hem, the silvered hair, the tired eyes, and then simply said, "Come with me, child. I've got beans on the stove and water heating." Mariama hesitated, unused to kindness that did not ask to be admired. Cosme gave her the smallest nod. She followed Jacinta toward the kitchen, past walls that smelled of lime wash and spice. But just before she disappeared through the doorway, she turned. Don Eligio had drawn Cosme aside onto the arcade, and though his voice was low, one sentence reached her clearly across the patio. "If that girl came out of a house like Los Remedios," the older merchant murmured, "you may already be carrying more danger than cloth." That warning stayed with Mariama as Jacinta led her through the kitchen door. Heat struck her first. After the wet road and the mountain chill, the room felt almost unreal. Beans simmered in a clay pot. Fresh tortillas rested beneath a folded cloth. Copper pans caught the light from the hearth, and steam rose from a bucket of hot water set near a wooden stool. Jacinta moved with the brisk certainty of a woman who had no patience for staring when there was work to do. She handed Mariama a coarse towel, then a clean shift that smelled of sun-dried cotton and rosemary. "You can wash at the screen there," she said. "And if anyone in this house asks foolish questions, send them to me." Mariama looked up, uncertain whether this was kindness or mockery. Jacinta snorted softly, as if she had read the thought. "Child, I have lived long enough to know that people fear whatever gives them an excuse to feel important. Sit. Eat while the tortillas are warm." So Mariama sat on the stool with the little crucifix tucked beside her bundle, and for the first time in many years, she ate while no one counted her bites. Jacinta asked no questions at first. She only set down beans, a wedge of squash cooked with onion, and a cup of atole thick enough to steady the stomach. When Mariama had taken several mouthfuls, the older woman leaned her hip against the table and said, almost casually, "I have never seen anyone with your coloring, but I have seen worse things than uncommon skin. I have seen men with pleasant faces and rotten souls. Yours does not frighten me." Mariama lowered her eyes to the bowl. "At Los Remedios it frightened everyone. Then Los Remedios is a small place pretending to be the whole world." Jacinta reached for a ladle. "It is not." In the arcade outside, voices drifted in and out with a rustle of hanging thread. Don Eligio had drawn Cosme toward his counting room, where bales of cloth were stacked beside ledgers, and the air smelled of cedar chests, ink, and dye. The older merchant shut the door before speaking again. "You are serious," he said. "She truly came from the Quintanar estate." Cosme nodded. "The master gave her over to me like he was clearing spoiled grain from a storeroom." Don Eligio's mouth hardened. "Men like that never discard trouble. They move it where they hope it cannot return." Cosme rested both hands on the back of a chair. He was tired in the bones, but there was a steadiness in him now that had not been there when he rode into the storm. "I know what it looks like. A roadside mercy, a soft heart, a passing inconvenience. But it is more than that." Don Eligio studied him with old, discerning eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "I thought it might be." Cosme looked toward the patio, though the walls hid her from him. "She has been treated all her life as an omen. I do not mean to become another man who decides what she is for his own comfort. Still..." He broke off and let out a breath. "Still, every time she speaks, I hear how carefully the world has tried to erase her." A man would have to be made of stone not to feel something. "And what do you feel?" Don Eligio asked. Cosme gave a tired, crooked smile. "At the very least, responsibility. Perhaps more than that already, which is unfortunate timing." The older man almost smiled back, but it faded quickly. "Then listen to me as if I were your father, and not your trading partner. If the people at that hacienda wrapped her in superstition, it was because plain cruelty serves better when dressed as piety. That sort of lie rarely stands alone. Somewhere behind it there is usually a debt, a shame, an inheritance, or a grave." When Mariama emerged from the kitchen in the borrowed shift and her damp hair loosely braided, Cosme looked up at once. Jacinta had rubbed a little oil into the dry ends, and the silver strands glimmered softly in the courtyard shade. Mariama noticed the two men fall quiet. She noticed too much not to. Later, After dusk settled blue over Orizaba and the house had quieted, she found Cosme near the gallery and spoke in a low voice. "There is one thing I did not tell you this morning," she said. "After I heard Doña Hortensia speaking with Father Anselmo, she came out of the chapel and saw me by the wall." Cosme turned fully toward her. Mariama's fingers closed around the wooden crucifix. "She looked at me as if I were not a servant's child at all, but the memory of something she had once tried to bury." Cosme did not press her at once after that. The gallery was cool and dim, open to a square of night sky where the last clouds were drifting apart above Orizaba. Somewhere beyond the patio wall, a cart rolled over stone and faded into the distance. Jacinta had banked the kitchen fire, and the house now carried that after-supper quiet found only in old homes. A creak of timber, a murmur from a servant's room, the faint scent of basil and ashes mingling in the air. Mariama stood with one hand around the crucifix and the other resting against the whitewashed pillar beside her. In the softer light, with her damp hair braided and her borrowed shift plain against her shoulders, she seemed less like the village omen people had named, and more like what she had always been, a young woman forced to carry other people's fear until it began to feel stitched into her own skin. "When she saw me by the chapel," Mariama said at last, "I thought she would strike me, or call for someone to drag me away. Instead, she only stared." Cosme kept his voice low. "And Father Anselmo?" "He came out a moment later. He looked where she was looking, at me and then at her. He told me to go back to the kitchens." Mariama's mouth tightened faintly. "But he did not sound angry. He sounded afraid of what might happen if I remained standing there one breath longer." She turned the crucifix over in her palm. "For years, I told myself I had imagined it, that a child hears scraps and makes stories from them. Yet every time Doña Hortensia crossed a courtyard and found me in it, I saw the same thing return to her face. Something more desperate." Cosme leaned one shoulder to the wall and thought of Aurelio's easy disposal, of Don Eligio's warning, of the words spoken through the chapel shutters. Piece by piece, the superstition around Mariama was taking on a human shape. "It may be nothing," Mariama said, though the way she said it told him she did not believe that. "A sin confessed, a vow broken, a dead child of her own? Women blame themselves for too many things in this world. Perhaps I was only convenient." "Perhaps," Cosme said. "But convenient lies are often built over something solid." She gave him a brief, searching look. "You truly do not think I bring ruin?" "I think ruin has hands, titles, and enough money to teach others what to fear." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Mariama said, "At the road shelter, when you said I were fortunate for you, I answered harshly." "You answered wisely." A flicker passed across her face, not quite a smile, something gentler. "I am not used to being heard the first time I speak," she said. "Then we begin a better custom." It was a simple line, but after it the silence between them changed. Not because trust had fully arrived. Trust rarely comes in one evening. Yet something had shifted from raw vigilance to the possibility of rest. The next morning dawned clean and bright over the city. Don Eligio's servants brought hot chocolate, rolls still warm from the oven, and fresh water for the road. Cosme settled his cloth case, checked the mule's shoes, and spoke with the older merchant near the gate. Mariama waited in the patio, watching shafts of sun move across the stone. Before they parted, Don Eligio took Cosme by the arm and said, "If you must continue, do it with open eyes. There are matters one can outride, and matters that keep pace." He turned then to Mariama with grave courtesy. "This house is small, but if ever the road bends you back through Orizaba, you may enter it without asking leave." Mariama bowed her head slightly, unused to such words and too moved to answer more than, "Thank you, senor." By mid-morning they were beyond the busier streets, climbing once more into the greener road where coffee bushes darkened the slopes and wet fern brushed the wheels. The city sounds dropped away behind them. For a time there was only the creak of leather, the soft knock of the mule's hooves, and the bright wash of mountain light after storm. Then, as they rounded a bend bordered by tall alders, Mariama looked back. Far down the road, almost hidden between the trunks, a mounted man in dark clothing had stopped his horse and was watching them without moving. She saw no face at that distance, only stillness.
Cosme,
she said quietly, and there was no mistaking the change in her voice.
We are no longer traveling alone.
At her words, Cosme turned in the seat and followed the line of her gaze. The bend behind them lay half in sun, half in leaf shadow. A rider could easily vanish there between one blink and the next, and that was almost what happened. By the time Cosme narrowed his eyes against the light, the dark shape had shifted back among the alders. He could not make out a face, only horse, rider, stillness, and then nothing at all but the trembling of branches. "Did you see him clearly?" he asked.
No.
Mariama kept looking over her shoulder a moment longer.
But he was looking at us. Not the road. Us.
Cosme drew the mule to a slower pace. The leather traces creaked softly. Water still glimmered in ruts from the night's storm, and now and then the wheel struck a stone with a hollow knock.
It may be some traveler with too much curiosity.
Mariama turned back toward the road ahead.
At the hacienda, men looked at me out of curiosity. This did not feel like that.
He believed her. She had spent a lifetime reading danger from the smallest shift in a room, the faintest change in a voice, the silence that falls before harm arrives. A person raised without safety learns such things too early and too well. By the time the sun had climbed toward noon, they had left the higher road and begun the long descent toward Córdoba. Cane fields spread in ordered green beyond the slopes, and the air grew thicker, warmer, touched now by the sweet, heavy smell of crushed stalks. Cart tracks deepened. More travelers appeared, teamsters, women with baskets, a friar on a mule, boys driving goats along the edge of the road. Being among others should have eased the tension. Instead, it made Mariama watchful in a different way. Every dark hat at a distance, every rider who slowed, every pause behind them tugged at her nerves. Cosme noticed. "My cousin keeps an inn in Córdoba," he said, partly to steady her, partly to steady himself. "Hilario Mendiola. He's a good man. Broad hands, broad laugh, a face like a baker who has misplaced his oven. If anyone can give us a little quiet, it will be him. You trust him? With money? No," Cosme said, and that won a quick, startled breath from her that was very nearly laughter. "With people? Yes." The city received them under a softer sky than Orizaba had, lower and warmer, its streets carrying the smell of molasses, wet dust, and cooking oil. Hilario's inn stood on a side street away from the busiest square, a modest place with whitewashed walls, a shaded corridor, and a central courtyard where geraniums grew in red clay pots around an old stone well. When he saw Cosme, Hilario came out wiping his hands on his apron, and embraced him hard enough to make the mule sidestep. "Saints preserve us," he boomed. "You look as if the mountains chewed you and spat you back with interest." "Then your mirror must show the same," Cosme answered. Hilario laughed, but his laughter softened when he noticed Mariama. He did not hide that he saw her, neither did he stare. His eyes took in her pale hair, the borrowed shift, the travel weariness in her face, and then settled on her as they would on any other guest in need of shelter. "You've brought company," he said. "I have brought someone who needs discretion," Cosme replied. Hilario's expression changed at once, less joking now, more careful. "Then she shall have it." He led them through the inn, past the dining room where broth and onions simmered, toward two small rooms at the back. The sheets smelled of sun and soap. A basin of clean water waited on a stool. Through the lattice window, Mariama could see a strip of courtyard and hear doves shifting in the eaves. It was humble, but after the road it felt almost tender. That evening,
After food had been sent up and the courtyard lamps were lit, Cosme told Hilario only the necessary part. Los remedios, the midnight departure, the mistress's fear, the rider on the road. Hilario listened without interrupting, elbows on the table, brow furrowed.
When Cosme finished, his cousin said, "If a man is trailing you this far from the estate, then he rides for more than gossip." At that very hour, in the open market 2 streets away, the maid Filomena was haggling over onions for the inn kitchen when she saw a dark-clothed horseman dismount near the fountain, scan the passing faces one by one, and ask the first stallholder whether a pale woman had entered the city with a cloth merchant. Filomena did not come back from the market at her usual pace. She entered Hilario's inn with her basket crooked against her hip, onions rolling against squash, breath quick from more than the walk. Her cheeks were pale beneath the flour dust she still wore from the kitchen, and she shut the courtyard door behind her with unusual care before crossing to where Hilario was trimming a lamp wick. Mariama had been helping fold clean cloths at the far table. The maid looked straight at her, then at Cosme.
"That man from the square," Filomena said, keeping her voice low. "I saw him again."
The courtyard seemed to tighten around the words. Evening had deepened. The smell of broth and warm stone drifted under the corridor, and somewhere beyond the wall a mule brayed. Hilario set the wick trimmer down without a sound. "Speak plain," he said. Filomena swallowed.
"He followed us through 3 stalls. First at the onions, then by the woman who sells peppers, then near the soap merchant. He never came close enough to touch us, but he kept turning up where we turned. Dark coat, hard face, the sort of man who watches first and asks later."
She looked at Mariama again.
"When I left the market, he stayed behind to question a spice seller. I heard him ask whether a pale-haired woman had been seen in the city with a cloth merchant."
Mariama's fingers tightened on the linen she had been folding. The cloth slipped from her lap. She did not speak. She did not need to. The fear had returned to her eyes with full memory now, as swift as floodwater rushing back into an emptied ditch. Cosme drew in a breath. "Then he's no wandering rider." "No," Hilario said grimly. "He came hunting." They moved at once to the back room where the ledgers were kept, shutting the door against stray ears. A single oil lamp burned on the table, making the shadows of their hands long across the wood. Filomena stood just inside the threshold, still clutching her market basket as if she had forgotten it was there. Mariama remained near the wall, the crucifix hidden beneath her bodice, listening. Cosme described the rider on the road and the urgency in Hortensia's fear. Hilario listened with the patient attention of a man who had spent years hearing drunken confessions and half-true stories from travelers, and knew when this was neither. "If the mistress sent someone," he said, "it would be a trusted one. A mayordomo, perhaps. A man used to obedience and silence." Mariama lifted her head.
"There is such a man. Wenceslao Otazio."
The name settled heavily in the room.
"He has been at Los Remedios longer than most of the trees in its yard," she went on. "As a child I thought he had no age at all. He spoke little. He saw everything. When punishments came, he rarely gave the order, but he was always near when it was carried out."
Filomena crossed herself quietly. Cosme looked to Hilario. "If it is him, he will not give up because a market woman shrugs at him." "No," Hilario said. "But a hunter can be turned if he follows the wrong hoofprints." He leaned back, thinking. Through the closed shutters came the muffled life of the street, a laugh, a passing cart, a dog shaking its chain. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will let it be known, very casually, that my cousin finished his business and went on toward Puebla with a strange young wife who keeps her face covered. Stable boys hear everything. So do muleteers. By noon the tale will be all over the market." Cosme frowned. "And Mariama?" "She does not stay here." Mariama spoke before Cosme could.
"If I leave now, I only lead him elsewhere."
Hilario nodded once. "True. So you do not leave by the front street." There is a cane ranch outside the city run by Doña Efrosina Verastegui, a widow with more backbone than most men and no patience for foolish superstition. She hires free hands when the season turns. If you go there quietly, dressed plainly, and keep out of the market for a few days, the trail may split. Mariama's face changed at that word. Free. She still seemed unsure what to do with it when it touched her directly. Cosme watched her in the lamp glow. I won't hide you without your consent. That mattered. It always mattered now. Before she could answer, footsteps crossed the outer corridor and stopped just beyond the door. All four of them fell still. Then came a knock. Soft, deliberate, and far too measured for any servant bringing supper. For one long second, nobody in the ledger room breathed. The lamp flame gave a nervous twitch. Filomena's basket slipped against her skirt with a dry rustle of onion skins. Mariama felt her pulse in her throat, hard and hot, while Cosme's hand moved almost without thought toward the latch, not to open it, but to stand between the door and whatever waited outside. Then Hilario lifted one palm, warning silence, and crossed the floor with the careful tread of a man who had spent years listening for trouble before it announced itself by name. "Who is it?" he asked through the wood.
Jacinta, from next door,
came a woman's voice, muffled but ordinary.
I've brought back your copper pot before dawn steals my memory.
The air left the room all at once. Filomena laughed once under her breath, half from relief, half from shame at being frightened by cookware. Hilario opened the door a crack, took the pot with quick thanks, and shut it again. Yet the false alarm did not soften the truth. If anything, it sharpened it. They had all felt how near danger seemed already. Hilario turned back. "That settles it. She leaves before sunrise." No one argued. The rest of the night passed in low voices and small preparations. Filomena fetched a plain dark rebozo and an old straw hat with a drooping brim. Hilario found a faded work skirt and blouse that had belonged to a cousin's widow. They were coarse garments, smelling faintly of lye soap and cedar chest, but that was the point. Mariama's uncommon coloring could not be hidden entirely, yet it might be softened, blurred at a glance into something less memorable. Jacinta sent over cold tamales wrapped in cloth and a little packet of coarse salt for the road. Even these modest acts of help seemed to move Mariama more than she could say. Just before dawn, while the inn still held the blue hush between sleep and labor, Cosme knocked softly at her room. Mariama opened at once. She had not slept. The borrowed clothes made her look smaller somehow, younger, though the watchfulness in her face remained. She wore the rebozo low, shading her hair. The wooden crucifix hung hidden beneath the blouse, close against her skin. "Are you certain?" Cosme asked. She understood what he meant. Not the road, the separation.
If I stay, I endanger your cousin, she said. And if that man is truly from Los Remedios, then every hour I remain here makes the inn easier to search.
You need not explain prudence to me, he said softly. I only wanted to know whether you choose this. Mariama looked at him for a quiet moment. In the courtyard beyond, a cock crowed once, thin in the dark. I do not like it, she admitted, but I choose it. That answer pleased him more than obedience would have. They left through the service gate as the eastern sky paled behind the roofs of Córdoba. Hilario drove the small cart himself, with sacks of beans piled in back to make the errand seem ordinary. Filomena went along too, chattering on purpose about kitchen purchases and hens, so that any watcher at a distance would see no secret flight, only country business at first light. Cosme rode beside the cart on the mule, eyes sweeping road and hedgerow. Mariama sat in the rear beneath the sacks, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The land outside the city widened quickly into cane country. Mist lay low over the fields, silvering the furrows. The smell there was sweet and green, thick with wet leaves, cut stalks, and the dark breath of irrigated earth. Workers had not yet filled the rows, and the quiet made every wheel turn sound louder. By full morning, they reached the Verastigi ranch. It was no grand estate, only a broad timber house, weathered sheds, a boiling shed for syrup, and long green fields running toward a line of ceiba trees. But everything in the place bore the mark of use rather than display. Chickens scratched beneath the porch. A pair of dogs slept in the shade of an ox cart. From the kitchen chimney rose a steady smoke that smelled of coffee and corn cakes. Doña Efrosina Verastigi met them on the porch, with her sleeves rolled and a ring of keys at her belt. She was a widow of perhaps 50, straight-backed, sun-browned, with eyes that missed little and forgave even less foolishness. She listened while Hilario gave the trimmed version of Mariama's story, a free young woman in need of work, quiet lodging, and a few weeks beyond the city's gossip. Euphrosina's gaze moved to Mariama and stayed there long enough to make any lie impossible. "Can you work?" she asked.
Yes, señora. Do you steal? No. Do you complain before noon?
A tiny pause, then,
Not if I can help it.
the widow's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Good. You may stay." Mariama had just begun to breathe easier when one of the ranch boys came running from the lane, barefoot and wild-eyed, and blurted out that a dark horse had been seen on the road from Córdoba, with a rider asking whether the Verastigi place hired new women hands. Doña Efrosina did not waste even half a heartbeat on panic. She turned from the breathless ranch boy to Mariama, took in the girl's pale face beneath the borrowed rebozo, and snapped her fingers once toward a servant woman carrying a basket of cane knives.
Tomasa, take her to the drying shed. Put soot on the part in her hair and dust her cheeks with ash. Then set her among the women sorting stocks. Her sharp gaze shifted to Cosme and Hilario. You two stay where men can be seen. A hidden thing draws the eye faster than an honest one. The whole yard moved at once under that command. Dogs rose and barked. Laborers crossed between wagons. Tomasa caught Mariama lightly by the wrist and hurried her toward a long shed smelling of molasses, dust, and cut cane. Inside, morning light slipped through cracks in the boards in bright, narrow lines. Women were already at work there, stripping leaves, tying bundles, gossiping in low voices. No one stopped to gape. Tomasa rubbed a little soot between her fingers and darkened the line where Mariama's silver hair showed beneath the scarf. "Hold still," she muttered. "Pretty or plain, any face can be overlooked if there's enough work around it." Mariama obeyed. Her heart was beating hard enough to make her hands tremble, but the ordinary touch of another woman's fingers did something curious to her fear. It did not erase it, it anchored it. Outside, Euphrosina walked down to the lane herself by the time the rider came into view. He did not enter at once. He reined in beneath the ceibas, a dark shape against the brightening road, and for a moment Mariama could see him only through the cracks in the shed wall, a hat brim, one gloved hand, the squared stillness of a man trained to observe before speaking. Even at that distance, she knew him. Wenceslao Otazio, the same unreadable face from Los Remedios, the same heavy patience. He spoke with Efrosina longer than Mariama liked. Cosme remained near the cart as if discussing bean prices with Hilario, but every muscle in him seemed pulled taut. Twice, Wenceslao looked toward the sheds. Twice, Efrosina blocked his sight with some practical gesture, pointing instead toward the corrals, toward the boiling shed, toward the mule teams. When at last he rode off, it was not with the ease of a satisfied man. He glanced back once before the road bent away. Only then did Mariama realize she had been holding her breath. Efrosina came into the shed smelling of horse, dust, and authority. "He asked whether I had taken in a pale young woman from Córdoba," she said. "I told him I take in whoever can work and turn away whoever asks questions before earning the right. He did not like my answer." A brief, hard smile touched her mouth. "That is his misfortune." Tomasa snorted. The other women returned to their sorting. Cosme was not given long to stay. That, too, was Efrosina's judgment. "If he is following the merchant, then the merchant must be seen leaving," she said.
"If he is following the girl, then the girl must become one more field hand among many. Either way, the pair cannot remain in one picture. Those words struck Mariama harder than the threat had. She had known the separation was part of the plan. Knowing a thing and living the moment of it are very different burdens. When Cosme came to the shed to say farewell for now, the women gave them a little space without appearing to. Cane leaves rasped softly under quick hands. The air was sweet with crushed stalks and hot dust. "I will not be far," he told her. Mariama looked at the floorboards between them first, then up.
"People say that before roads prove otherwise."
He accepted the wound in that without flinching. "Then I will say something plainer. I mean to return." That answer landed better. She gave the smallest nod. After he left, his figure diminishing beyond the wagons with Hilario beside him, Mariama stood very still until the sound of wheels faded. It was one of the women sorting cane who finally touched her elbow and said, "If you stare at the road all day, the stalks won't strip themselves." The speaker was a young widow with sun-browned skin and clear, dark eyes, perhaps a few years older than Mariama. There was gentleness in her face, but also a certain firmness that comes when grief has already taken its payment and left a person standing.
"I am Anselma Quiros," she said. "My husband died in last year's Safra, and that taught me the world keeps moving, whether we consent or not. Sit beside me. Work goes faster when sorrow has company."
Mariama sat. For a while they stripped cane in silence. Then, toward midday, when the others were talking of weather and wages, Anselma said quietly, without looking at her,
"That rider who came asking, he had the manner of a Quintanar man."
Mariama's hands stilled on the stalk. Anselma lowered her voice still further.
"My late husband once worked near Los Remedios. He heard things there, old things.
About a missing brother in that family, and a scandal no one in the district speaks of above a whisper." Mariama kept stripping cane, though for a moment she could no longer feel the stalk in her hands. Around her, the shed went on with its ordinary music, leaves rasping, women talking of prices and weather, a child laughing somewhere near the boiling shed, the dull thud of bundles hitting the floorboards. That was the strange mercy of labor. The world asks for your hands even when your thoughts are elsewhere. Anselma, seated beside her, did not press at once. She picked fibers from her skirt, split another stalk with practiced fingers, and waited until the others had drifted into a louder conversation of their own.
"My husband heard the name at night,"
she said quietly. "Men speak most freely after work, when they think only the dark is listening." The brother's name was Severiano. The name meant nothing to Mariama at first, yet something in the way Anselma said it made the skin along her arms turn cold despite the heat in the shed.
"He belonged to the Quintanar family?"
Mariama asked.
"Yes, Don Aurelio's brother."
Anselma kept her eyes on the cane. "Older, if my husband remembered right. Better liked by some, worse liked by others. The kind of man who rode where he pleased and thought that wanting a thing gave him some right to it." Mariama swallowed.
"And the scandal?"
Anselma hesitated, not from reluctance, but from care. "Only that there was talk he had entangled himself with an enslaved woman. Some called it lust, some called it shame, and one old hand swore it had become something more dangerous than either. Then suddenly the man was gone. Dead, they said, or traveling, or fevered on the road. Every mouth told it differently, which usually means none of them were given the truth." The shed felt smaller after that. Mariama watched dust turning gold in a shaft of sunlight and tried to fit this new fragment against the old ones she carried, Hortensia's fear, Father Anselmo's hush, the hatred woven around her birth, the sense of being treated not as a servant among servants, but as a presence that had to be explained away.
"Did your husband ever name the woman?" she asked.
Anselma shook her head. "No. If he knew, he never said it aloud. Men may gossip, but they still know when a woman's name has been buried on purpose." They worked currently noon. Sweat dampened Mariama's borrowed blouse. Cane sweetness clung to her hands no matter how many times she wiped them on her skirt. Yet for the first time since leaving Los Remedios, her mind had something firmer than dread to circle around. Not answers, a direction. That evening, Cosme returned under the excuse of bringing a bundle of trade cloth for Eufrosina's household accounts. He had not dared come sooner. Wenceslao, Hilario reported, had remained in Córdoba longer than a man following a simple rumor ought to remain. He was asking in taverns, near stables, among market women, never rudely, never twice to the same person. A patient hound. The kind that keeps its nose to the same track until either the trail vanishes or the quarry makes a mistake. Eufrosina let Cosme speak with Mariama only after supper, in the open courtyard where anyone passing could see nothing more suspicious than two people discussing work. The widow had a keen instinct for what safety required. There, beneath a hanging lamp that drew moths in soft circles, Mariama told him what Anselma had said. Cosme listened with that grave stillness she had come to trust in him. When she spoke the name Severiano, he leaned back a fraction, eyes narrowing in thought. "A missing brother," he murmured. "A mistress who fears old words, a priest who wanted silence, and a household that wrapped your birth in stories of blight and infant death." Mariama touched the edge of her sleeve where the crucifix lay hidden beneath. "It may still be nothing." "It is not nothing," he said. She looked at him, waiting. Cosme lowered his voice. "While I was in Córdoba, I wrote to a man I know in Jalapa. He is retired now, but for years he worked as a scribe with the Curia in Veracruz. If anyone knows how old parish records are kept, altered, or hidden, it will be him." Mariama felt her breath catch. Until that moment, the past had seemed made only of rumor and memory, of things overheard through shutters and carried by tired women's mouths. Records belonged to another world, to ink, to proof. "What did you ask him?" "How families with influence bury births they do not wish remembered," Cosme said. "And whether priests and midwives have ever helped them do it." The lamp flame stirred in the night air between them. Then Cosme reached into his satchel and drew out a folded letter, still sealed with cracked wax. "It arrived this afternoon," he said. "I have not opened it yet." For a moment, neither of them touched the letter. The ranch courtyard had gone hushed in that hour after supper, when even the insects seemed to lower their voices. From the cookhouse came the fading smell of wood smoke and boiled coffee. Somewhere out in the cane, a night bird called once, and then again. Cosme held the folded paper between finger and thumb as though it carried more weight than ink should have. "At least now we will have something firmer than rumor," he said. Mariama watched the cracked red wax at the fold. "Rumor has ruled my life well enough." He looked up at that, then gave a small nod, accepting the sting of truth in it. With the tip of his knife, he broke the seal and unfolded the sheet carefully. The hand inside was narrow and disciplined, the script of a man who had spent long years making orderly records out of other people's disorder. Cosme read first in silence. Mariama saw his eyes move, stop, return to the same line. When he finally spoke, he did so slowly, translating the old clerk's caution into plainer words. "My friend says that in families of standing, when a birth threatened inheritance, marriage claims, or public honor, there were times when the truth did not go into the first record. He says some houses paid to have entries softened, delayed, or rearranged. A mother named, but no father. A date shifted. A child placed under another woman's care in the books, if not in life." Mariama felt the night air thin around her. Cosme went on. "He writes that priests were not always eager for such things, but some yielded under pressure, others under money. And midwives—" His mouth tightened. "Midwives could be made useful, because they saw the child before any priest ever did." Mariama had both hands clasped in her lap now, so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale beneath the lamplight.
So it can be done. It has been done before, Cosme said. Often enough that he answered me without surprise.
He lowered the page and read a second passage more carefully. He advises that if the truth of a birth is in doubt, one must not look only at the baptism entry. One must compare the month's deaths, the margin notes, the sacramental books, and the names of those present at the birth. He says lies in parish ink rarely stand alone. They leave traces because too many hands help write them. The words settled between them with the dreadful clarity of a door opening inward. Mariama looked past him into the dark edge of the courtyard where the lamp did not reach. All her life, people had spoken of her as if she were a wonder, a warning, a punishment sent into the world already marked. Now another thought stood before her, colder and more human. What if the stain on her life had been planned, by careful hands arranging names on a page? Cosme folded the letter again, not to hide it, but to give the thought shape. If Hortensia fears old church questions, and if a priest once hushed her, then the records matter. Mariama let out a slow breath. There was a midwife. He waited. Not the one who first helped raise me. Older than that. Her name was Casilda. Mariama lifted her eyes back to him. She had hands like dry roots and a cough that never left her. When I was perhaps 14, maybe 15, she was dying in a pallet room behind the kitchens. I went in with broth because no one else wished to smell death before it arrived. She looked at me for a long time and asked whether I still wore my mother's cross. Cosme listened without moving. When I showed it to her, she began to weep. I had never seen her do that. She said, Mariama swallowed once. She said that the night I was born had never stopped visiting her in sleep. I asked why. She told me my coming into the world was not what the house had later claimed. Then she gripped my wrist and said if I ever wanted peace, I should learn whose fear had fed me all my life. The night bird called again, nearer now. Did she say anything else? Cosme asked quietly. She tried. Mariama's gaze had gone distant. She said a name first, or almost said it. I heard only the beginning before a fit of coughing took her breath away. After that, she could not manage more than fragments. The next morning, she was dead. Cosme stared at the folded letter in his hand. A priest who hushed, a mistress who feared, a dead midwife who tried to speak, a missing brother named by rumor. He lifted his head, and there was a new steadiness in his face now, one made of purpose rather than mere protection. Mariama, I do not think we can stay with guesses much longer. She knew it before he said the rest. We are going to need the parish books. The thought of going after the parish books altered the air between them more than the letter itself had done. Until then, Mariama's past had been a thing felt in the body, in stares, in whispers, in the way doors opened or did not open before her. Now it threatened to become visible on paper. That possibility should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a fear so sharp she almost wished to step back from it. If the books say what the house says, she asked quietly, what then? Cosme did not rush to comfort her. That was one of the reasons she trusted him more than she wished to admit. He let the question stand in its full weight. Then we will know the lie is older and deeper than we hoped, he said. And we go on from certainty rather than shadows. Mariama looked down at her hands. They still carried the sweetness of cane even after washing, a green scent that clung to the lines of her skin. And if the books say something worse? He studied her a moment before answering. Worse than being told all your life that your face poisons harvests and your birth blackened a house? Worse than having other people name you before you can name yourself? Whatever truth waits there, it did not make the harm. The harm was done already. That reached her where gentler words would not have. She let out a breath she had not noticed she was holding. By then, Euphrosina had joined them, bringing a second lamp and the plain steadiness of someone who has spent years sorting fear from usefulness. She read the mood at a glance. "You are thinking of priests and the registers," she said. Cosme handed her the folded letter. She did not bother pretending the matter was beneath her. After reading, she gave a low grunt. "I know enough of families with land to believe every word of these." She handed the paper back. "The trouble is not whether such records exist. The trouble is how to see them without putting your head directly into the jaws that want it." Mariama lifted her eyes. "There is a parish near Los Remedios." "I assumed as much," Euphrosina said. "And I assume the mistress's people would assume it too." The next day passed under a strain that work could not quite dissolve. Mariama sorted stocks with Anselma through the morning heat, while, somewhere between the furrows and the shade of the porch, plans were turned over by Cosme, Hilario, and Euphrosina. Wenceslao had not returned, yet his absence did not soothe anyone. It only suggested he was choosing his next move carefully. Near midday, when the women paused to drink from a bucket lowered into the yard well, Anselma spoke again. "If you truly mean to look for old records," she said, "do not go as someone seeking scandal. Men close books for pride even when they would open them for a fee, a favor, or the hint of inheritance." Mariama gave her a quick look. "How would you know that?" Anselma wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. "Because my husband once drove a priest 3 leagues with a trunk full of ledgers, and afterward the priest drank too much aguardiente and complained that every family in the district wanted heaven to witness only the parts of their lives that looked clean." A faint, humorless smile touched her face. "Church books remember more than sermons do." That evening, Hilario returned from Córdoba with fresh word. He had not brought bad news, exactly. He had brought something more dangerous. Practicality. "There is a parish of San Lorenzo 2 days from here," he said after supper, seated at Euphrosina's long table with the lamplight pooling over beans, tortillas, and the open letter. "Close enough to the Quintanar lands to hold what we need, far enough from the main house that one might ask questions without walking straight into Aurelio's courtyard. The sacristan there is an old man named Eutimio Rodan. Honest, absent-minded, fond of proper records, and convinced everyone else in the world misplaces paper." Euphrosina snorted softly. "A useful vanity." Hilario nodded. "He knows me by sight. If I go as a man checking dates for a property matter, he may let me see what others would be denied." Cosme leaned forward. "And if he asks why I am there? You are my cousin, and a witness to a debt. You say little. Let me talk." All through this, Mariama had been silent. At last, she spoke. "If I go near those lands again, I may freeze when the hour comes." Euphrosina's gaze rested on her, steady and unsparing. "Then freeze after the books are opened." The plainness of it almost made Mariama smile. The plan took shape before midnight. They would leave quietly, not by the road Wenceslao knew, but by a lesser track through cane and hill pasture. Hilario would lead. Cosme would accompany him. Mariama would go because the records, if found, must be seen by the very eyes they concerned. While the 3 of them bent over routes, names, and timings in the yellow circle of lamplight, none of them knew that on the far side of Córdoba, in a room above a tavern, Wenceslao Otazio had already abandoned the false trail toward Puebla and was studying a scrap of information that named the Verastegui ranch. They left the ranch before the first rooster finished crowing. Mist lay low over the cane, turning the world soft and uncertain. Hilario drove the small cart this time, wrapped in a plain serape, looking exactly like a man bound for some dull errand of accounts and grain. Cosme rode beside him, with the cloth merchant's road-worn patience on his face, while Mariama sat deeper in the cart beneath 2 folded blankets and a sack of meal. The disguise was not elegant. That was why it might work. Doña Euphrosina walked them to the gate with a lamp in one hand and no trace of fuss in her manner. "If anyone asks," she said, "you are settling a boundary matter near San Lorenzo.
If anyone asks twice, you know too little to answer." Then she looked directly at Mariama. "Do not let fear make your mind lazy. Fear is useful only when it sharpens." Mariama held that sentence in silence as the cart rolled away. The road they took was not the main one. It wound first through pasture and low groves of guava, then climbed through hill country where the soil turned stony and the brush smelled of wild sage after the night damp. Morning came slowly between clouds. Birds flashed through the thorn trees. Once they passed a woman washing clothes at a creek, once a boy driving 3 mules, once a muleteer who barely lifted his head. Each ordinary sight soothed Mariama a little, then gave way to the next unease. Ordinary roads had carried secrets before. By midday, when the sun burned the mist away, her back ached from the jolting cart, and her thoughts had grown too loud to bear in silence. "If the record names another woman," she said suddenly, "what becomes of my mother?" Cosme turned toward her. "Adjua remains your mother." "In affection, yes. In life? Yes." Mariama's fingers worried the edge of the blanket. "But if the books place me elsewhere?" Hilario answered before Cosme could. "Ink has the bad habit of believing itself more powerful than flesh. It is often wrong." That was such an old man's answer, and such a true one, that Mariama let out the smallest breath that might have become a laugh in another hour. They reached San Lorenzo late in the day. The village sat on a rise above a narrow river, with tiled roofs, white walls browned by weather, and one modest church bell tower lifting over the square. Chickens pecked in the dust beneath the jacarandas. A saddler worked with his door open. A woman sold sweet fritters from a tray near the fountain. Nothing in the place looked grand enough to guard a secret, yet Mariama felt the moment they entered the square that her life had somehow been waiting here in silence for years. Hilario did not take them first to the church. He took them to a small posada with blue shutters and a courtyard shaded by one orange tree. "Never walk straight at the thing you want," he murmured once they were inside. "A man who hurries toward records has already announced that he fears what they hold." They waited until evening. When the shadows had lengthened and most villagers were inside their homes, Hilario crossed to the parish house alone. Cosme and Mariama remained at the posada with a pot of weak chocolate growing cold between them. The waiting was its own labor. Through the open lattice they could hear the village settling, sandals on stone, a baby crying, the church bell marking the hour, dogs barking once and then giving up. Mariama sat very still. Cosme watched her for a while before saying, "You can still choose not to continue." She gave him a level look. "No, I cannot. Not anymore." He accepted that, too. When Hilario returned, dusk had turned nearly to dark, and dust clung to the hem of his cloak. He shut the courtyard door himself before speaking. "Eutimio Roldan remembers me," he said. "More importantly, he remembers my uncle's lawsuit over irrigation rights from 15 years ago, which means he believes I am exactly the kind of tedious man who would come chasing dates through parish books." A quick, tired smile crossed his face. "He has agreed to let us consult old registers tomorrow afternoon, when the priest is visiting a dying woman upriver." Mariama's heart thudded once, hard. Hilario's smile vanished as quickly as it had come. "But there is a condition. He says we must be quick, discreet, and prepared for what we find. He also said something else." Cosme straightened. "What?" Hilario lowered his voice. "He said the name Quintanar has not passed through those books cleanly in many years." The next afternoon seemed to arrive by inches. Mariama spent the morning hearing every small sound in the posada, as if each one were a warning. The scrape of chairs in the courtyard, the splash of water poured into basins, the bell from San Lorenzo striking the hours with a patience she found almost cruel. When at last Hilario said it was time, her mouth had gone dry enough that even the bread set before her at noon felt like dust. They crossed the village quietly, not together at first. Hilario went ahead with the relaxed pace of a man carrying out some tedious business. Cosme followed after a useful interval.
Mariama came last, her rebozo drawn low, eyes fixed on the sun-warmed stones beneath her feet. The church stood at the edge of the square, modest and old, its plaster flaking near the base, its bell tower casting a narrow shadow over the cemetery wall. Bougainvillea spilled in faded crimson over one side of the sacristy. The whole place smelled of hot lime, wax, and old earth. Eutimio Roldan met them at a side door with a ring of keys in one hand and a face that seemed assembled out of wrinkles, dust, and caution. He was not quite frail, though age had softened him. His eyes, pale and restless, moved from Hilario to Cosme and lingered just a moment on Mariama, before looking away again with tact rather than suspicion. "Quickly," he said. "Father Benito is with the widow Salcedo and should not return for at least an hour, perhaps more if she wishes to confess every bad thought she has had since childhood." He shut the door behind them and lowered his voice. "You did not hear me say that." The archive room lay beyond the sacristy, tucked behind a heavy wooden door swollen by old damp. When Eutimio opened it, a breath of cooler air came out, carrying the smell of leather, ink, mildew, and dust long settled into paper. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. On them rested volumes bound in cracked brown hide, their spines marked in faded hand. The sight of them made Mariama stop. For the first time in her life, she was standing in a room where silence had been keeping names alive. Eutimio set 3 ledgers on the table with the care of a man laying out relics. "Baptisms, births, and deaths for the years you indicated," he murmured. "Do not lick your fingers to turn pages. Do not lean your sleeves in the margins. And for the love of heaven, if you sneeze, turn your head." Hilario gave a solemn nod fit for a magistrate's hearing. Cosme almost smiled. Mariama could not. They began. At first, the search was clumsy, names blurred, ink changed from one priest's hand to another. Pages rasped softly as they turned. Hilario checked the year against his memory of Mariama's age. Cosme searched for the estate name. Mariama leaned over the book until her eyes ached, tracing the lines with a finger she made herself keep steady. Then Cosme drew a sharp breath. "There," he said. The entry was brief, too brief. A girl child baptized within days of birth. Mother, Ajoa, enslaved woman in the service of the Quintanar family. Place, lands of Los Remedios. Father, left blank. Mariama stared at the name until the room seemed to tilt around it. Ajoa. Not the name her mother had spoken aloud every day, for she had no living memory of the older woman saying it in full. At the hacienda, she had been called only the Guinea woman, or that one from across the water, as if even a name might have given her too much shape in the world. Yet here it was, written in dark, faded ink that had survived years, priests, storms, and mold. Her mother had not vanished entirely. A hand had once written her into existence. Mariama's fingers hovered over the page without touching it. "Ajoa," she whispered. Cosme looked at her, but did not speak. He knew enough to leave that moment standing unbroken. It was Hilario who noticed the next thing. "There is something in the margin," he said. The note had been added in a different hand, lighter and narrower, as though years later someone had returned to the page with an uneasy conscience, or a necessary instruction. Eutimio bent closer, squinting. "Verify with death register," he read slowly. "Then a name." He wet his lips, frowned, and bent still nearer. "Quintanar. Severiano Quintanar. Same month." The blood seemed to drain from Mariama's body all at once. Cosme turned immediately toward the shelf marked for deaths, reaching for the volume with a hand that no longer moved leisurely at all. And just then, from somewhere out in the church corridor, came the faint, unmistakable sound of the outer door opening. The sound in the corridor froze every hand above the table. Eutimio straightened so quickly his chair legs scraped the floor. From beyond the swollen door came the murmur of a man's voice, low at first, then a little clearer, asking whether Father Benito had returned. Not the priest's voice, Not a villager calling from the square. This one carried the clipped patience of a man used to getting answers from servants, guards, and stable boys. Cosme had already pulled the death ledger toward him. "Read," Mariama whispered. He opened to the month marked in the margin note, fingers moving faster now, page after page giving off the dry, papery smell of old glue and mildew. Hilario stood half-turned toward the door, ready to bar it if needed, though all three of them knew that would only buy seconds. Eutimio moved to the crack of the archive door and listened, one hand trembling on the keyring. Then Cosme found it. "Here," he breathed. The entry was short, formal, almost indifferent. Severiano Quintanar, dead on the road toward Veracruz. Cause given as tropical fevers. Date, 3 weeks before the birth entry that named Ajua, and no father. Mariama felt the words strike her like cold water. 3 weeks, the same month, the same family. The same careful emptiness where a father's name should have stood. Hilario bent over the book, reading it twice. "Too neat," he said under his breath. "Far too neat." Cosme's jaw tightened. If Anselma's rumor was true, then this death fell exactly where someone needed it to fall. From the corridor came another voice now, older and more brittle. Eutimio answering through the door with forced cheer, saying Father Benito was still away upriver and that no one had entered the archive. The first voice replied something Mariama could not fully catch, but she heard enough to know it was asking not about books now, but about a merchant and a pale-haired young woman. Her stomach dropped. Eutimio shut the door and turned back to them with all the color gone from his face. "You must leave at once." Cosme closed the ledger softly. "Who is it?" "I do not know his name, but I know the kind. A statesman, hard eyes, too interested in matters that are none of his." Eutimio swallowed. "He came from the square, asking whether strangers had been seen here, and one fool of a boy pointed in toward the church because he had seen your cart." Mariama's hands had gone numb. "He found us." "Not yet," Eutimio said sharply, "but he will, if you stand there mourning ink." He crossed to a smaller door hidden behind a hanging cloth at the back of the archive. "There is a passage into the old cemetery. It opens behind the wall among the cypress trees. Go through there, circle to the river path, and do not show yourselves again in the square." Hilario blinked at him. Why help us this much? For the first time since they had met him, the old sacristan looked directly at Mariama. His pale eyes held something heavier. "Because when I was young," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "I served Mass for the priest who kept these books before Father Benito. I carried water, lit candles, and learned when not to ask questions. I also learned how certain families bend truth until it limps." His gaze flicked toward the open birth register. "I remember that year better than I wish to. A man from Los Remedios came twice in 1 month, once for a death, once for a child. The priest drank himself sick after both visits." Mariama stared at him. Eutimio gave a bitter little shake of the head. "I was too young then to stop anything." "I will not be useless now." From outside came the heavy tread of boots drawing nearer, then the hard knock of knuckles on wood. "Open," called the same controlled voice from the corridor. "I am asking only a few questions." Cosme took Mariama by the arm, not roughly, just firmly enough to move her before fear rooted her to the floor. Hilario gathered the folded note he had copied in haste. Eutimio pulled aside the hanging cloth and revealed the narrow back door, its hinges furred with rust. As Mariama crossed the threshold into the chill dark beyond, she looked back once and saw the old sacristan set his shoulders, smooth his face into harmless bewilderment, and turn toward the main door just as the knocking came again. Louder this time. The cemetery path dropped behind the church in a narrow strip of shade between leaning crosses and cypress roots. Mariama nearly stumbled on the loose stones at first, not from clumsiness but from the force of her own heartbeat. The hidden door banged softly shut behind them, and at once the sounds of the church were muffled by walls, earth, and distance. Ahead lay the river path Eutimio had named, a low trail ribboning through reeds and willow scrub, damp underfoot, smelling of mud, moss, and stagnant water warmed by the afternoon sun. Hilario did not speak until the church bell tower was half lost behind the trees. "Not the square," he muttered. "Not the posada. We cut south and circle wide." Cosme kept one hand near Mariama's elbow whenever the bank steepened, though he never dragged or hurried her like cargo. Twice they stopped to listen, once for hoofbeats that proved to belong to a farmer crossing the ford upstream, once for voices on the road above them that passed and faded. By the time they reached the shelter of a disused lime kiln in the hills, the light had gone copper at the edges. Only then did Hilario unfold the scrap he had copied from the registers. He read it aloud again, because sometimes hearing a thing twice makes it feel more solid, and sometimes it only makes it more terrible. Adjua named as mother, no father named. Margin note directing attention to Severiano Quintanar's death in the same month. Death recorded 3 weeks before Mariama's birth. Cosme sat on a fallen block of stone, with both elbows braced on his knees. Dust streaked his boots. The old lime kiln smelled of dry earth, ash long settled into cracks, and the sharp green of weeds pushing up through ruin. "If we continue to run," he said, "we hand them the advantage forever. Each village becomes a trap, each priest, each market, each roof." Mariama had been standing apart, looking down the slope where the road curved out of sight. She turned slowly at that. "So we stop running?" she asked. Her voice held no softness. It was the voice of a woman who had spent her whole life being cornered and wanted plain words now. Hilario answered before Cosme could soften the thought. "No, we choose where the next ground will be. There is a difference." And in that moment, Mariama understood it. The sun sank lower. Swallows cut dark lines across the bright sky. Somewhere in the ravine below, water moved over rock with a steady hush. "What do we have?" she asked. Cosme looked up at her. "We have your mother's name in the record. We have the margin note. We have Severiano's death entered with suspicious convenience. We have your memory of Hortensia and Father Anselmo. We have the dying words of Casilda, even if only in fragments. And we have a pursuer so persistent he has all but confessed that your existence threatens someone powerful." Mariama listened without blinking. "It still may not be enough," he added. "No," she said, "but it is more than I had yesterday." That was when Hilario said the thing that shifted the shape of the road before them. "There is one man who might force this matter into daylight before the Quintanars bury it again. Don Crisoforo Aldana, the regional magistrate." Cosme frowned. "Do you trust him?" "I trust no man in authority without reserve," Hilario said dryly. "But I trust his hunger for public order. He likes documents, hates private feuds spilling into trade routes, and enjoys being seen as just. If we place the matter before him with parish evidence and the clear suggestion of falsified record-keeping, he cannot easily ignore it." Mariama came closer then, the dusk softening her features without lessening the strain in them. "And if he decides the word of a great house weighs more than mine?" "Then at least the truth will have been spoken where it can be heard by more than one frightened priest," Cosme said. She was silent for a long while after that. The first evening insects had begun their dry music. Hilario wrapped the copied note again and tucked it into his inner pocket. Above them, the sky was darkening from gold to violet. At last, Mariama said, "If I keep fleeing, Doña Hortensia will hunt me until one of us dies, or one of us disappears. I know her kind of fear now. It does not sleep. I would rather stand before a magistrate with shaking hands than spend the rest of my life listening for hoofbeats behind every wall." Cosme rose. "Then that is what we do." The decision, once spoken, seemed to steady all three of them. Their course would bend not back to Los Remedios itself, not yet, but toward the magistrate's town by a rough inland track Hilario knew from old supply trips. They would travel at first light. They would avoid inns where possible. They would speak to no one unnecessarily. Night had almost closed around the kiln when Hilario climbed the slope a few paces to study the road one last time. He stood there longer than he meant to. Then he came back down, face altered, and spoke so quietly that even the crickets seemed louder than his words. "We leave, now," he said. "There is a rider on the northern ridge, and he has not taken his eyes off this place for the last 5 minutes." They did not wait to see whether the rider would descend from the ridge. By moonrise, they were already on the move, taking the rough inland track Hilario had named, a mean path of stone, scrub, and narrow turns where carts protested and mules placed their feet with care. The night smelled of dry grass, dust, and the faint metallic scent that rises from rocks after a day of heat. Mariama rode in the cart, though she could not have said later whether she sat or floated through those hours. Her thoughts kept circling the same fixed points: Ajua's name, the margin note, Severiano's death, the boots outside the archive door. No one spoke much. The road demanded too much attention, and fear had a way of making even breathing feel noisy. Near dawn they reached a high pass where the hills pressed in close, leaving only a stony throat of road between them. On one side the slope fell away into thorn and shadow. On the other rose a wall of broken rock, striped with lichen and pale roots. It was the kind of place where sound carried strangely. A hoofbeat struck once and came back twice. A cartwheel grated and seemed to answer itself from the cliff face. Hilario, who had been driving in grim silence, suddenly tightened the reins. There, in the middle of the pass, stood a mounted figure on a dark horse. He had positioned himself where the road narrowed most. There was no rush in him, no flourish. He sat straight in the saddle, one hand on the reins, the other resting near his belt. The sky behind him was whitening at the edges, enough to shape his face before they were close enough to read it fully. Mariama knew him before the others did. "Wenceslao," she said. Cosme stepped down from the cart before it had fully stopped. Gravel shifted beneath his boots. Hilario muttered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or a curse. The morning wind came cold through the pass, lifting a strand of Mariama's hair free of the scarf. She tucked it back without thinking. Wenceslao Otazio looked older in the dawn than he had on the road below Los Remedios, but more tired than old. He did not greet them. He only said, "You have made this more difficult than it needed to be." Hilario gave a dry laugh. Men who follow women through churchyards and cane fields rarely get to complain of difficulty. Wenceslao ignored him. His eyes rested on Cosme. "Hand her over. You have gone far enough. Whatever kindness you meant to perform, it has already cost too much." Cosme stood his ground. "Too much for whom?" "For everyone touched by what you are stirring up." Mariama watched the mayordomo's face as he said it. There was no superstition there, no peasant terror of omens. What lived in him was something harder to untangle: duty worn thin by years, obedience made sour, a burden carried too long without breaking. Cosme seemed to see it too. "You know," he said quietly, "that is why you were sent. Not because of harvest tales, but because the books point somewhere your mistress cannot afford." The words struck cleanly. Wenceslao's jaw tightened once. Hilario glanced at Cosme sharply, but Cosme went on. "We found Ajua's name. We found the note linking Mariama's birth to Severiano Quintanar's death in the same month. We found more than enough to place the matter before Don Crisoforo Aldana. If anything happens to us now, that path does not close. It opens wider." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Wenceslao's face. The horse stamped once against the stone. A little shower of grit slid from the cliff wall. Dawn lifted another shade, enough now for all of them to see one another clearly. Mariama climbed down from the cart. Cosme half turned, ready to stop her if she wished it, but she was already moving. Not rashly, not near enough to reach him, only far enough that her voice would not need to be thrown.
All my life, she said, people have spoken over me, about me, around me. You will not do it now.
The air in the pass seemed to narrow around her words.
If you have ridden this far to silence me, then first you will tell me what I am to your house, besides a burden wrapped in lies.
Wenceslao stared at her.
For one suspended moment, even the wind seemed to wait.
Then his gaze dropped from her face to the road between them, and when he spoke, his voice no longer carried the iron certainty of a servant enforcing another person's will. "You think you are asking for a name," he said. "What you are asking for is a grave, a sin, and the worst thing I have ever done." The pass held still around that confession, like a church holds still around a grave. Wenceslao did not move from the saddle at first. Dawn had risen enough now to show the strain in his face plainly, the deepening at the mouth, the bruised shadows beneath the eyes, the look of a man who had obeyed too long and reached the edge of what obedience could carry. The horse beneath him tossed its head once, impatient with the human misery tightening the air. Cosme said nothing. He understood, perhaps better than Hilario did, that to interrupt now would be to drive the truth back behind the man's teeth. Mariama stood where she was, every part of her body taut.
"Then speak it."
Wenceslao closed his eyes only for a breath. When he opened them again, he looked not at Cosme or Hilario, but at her. "Severiano Quintanar loved your mother," he said. The words did not come out with drama. That made them land harder. Mariama's throat worked once, but she said nothing. "He was no saint," Wenceslao went on. "He was born to land and expectation and the careless habits of men who think desire is a small sin if it costs them nothing. But with Adjua, it ceased to be small. He meant to acknowledge what he had done, meant to free her, meant to free the child she carried, meant more than that, if truth be told." His mouth twisted bitterly. He meant to alter lines of inheritance that others had already written in their heads. Hilario drew in a breath. Cosme's face had gone very still. Wenceslao continued before either man could speak. Don Aurelio was not yet secure in what he believed should be his. Doña Hortensia less so. She feared scandal, yes, but she feared property more. If Severiano named the child and set land aside for mother and daughter, then blood, law, and shame would all begin pulling in directions the house could not control.
"And so?"
Mariama asked. Her voice had thinned, but it did not break. "And so," Wenceslao said, "they chose concealment first, and then worse." The morning wind moved through the pass with a low, dry whisper. Somewhere above them a hawk cried once. Your mother was not allowed to remain where Severiano might reach her openly after the birth. She was sold away under another pretext once she had recovered enough to travel. You were kept because to remove both of you at once would have invited talk, and because a child can be made harmless by other means. His eyes flicked toward her pale hair, then away again. A story was put around you. Crop blight, dead infants, a sign of heaven's displeasure. A curse the powerful invented travels farther than a whip and leaves fewer marks. Mariama felt the world narrow to the sound of his voice and the pounding inside her own ribs. Her mother sold away. Not dead of neglect, not merely lost to fever and time, but taken from her life by design. Something inside her that had been numb for years seemed to wake all at once, and the waking hurt. Cosme took half a step toward her, then stopped when he saw she remained upright without reaching for him. "What of Severiano?" Hilario asked, rougher now. "Did he die of those fevers or not?" Wenceslao's face changed. Guilt was no longer hidden in it. It stood bare. "No." The word fell like stone. "I was the one sent with him on that last journey," he said. "I had served the family less than 10 years then. I was hungry, ambitious, grateful for the hand that had pulled me from nothing. Doña Hortensia spoke of duty, ruin, disgrace, the future of the estate. She spoke until my conscience sounded to me like weakness, and her fear sounded like reason. He looked down at his gloved hands as if they belonged to another man. There was no fever when we left, only a road, a ravine, and an arrangement from which he did not return. The silence afterward was monstrous. Mariama heard Hilario mutter a prayer. She heard the horse shifting its weight on gravel. She heard Cosme's breathing, slow and controlled, because he was mastering his anger for her sake. At last, Mariama said,
"All these years, you watched me grow under that lie."
Wenceslao nodded once. Yes.
"And now you come to stop me from finding it."
His answer took longer. "I came because she ordered it," he said. "But I did not ride all this way only for her. I rode because I wanted to see whether you had already learned enough that silence could no longer hold." He lifted his head fully then. "It cannot." Cosme's eyes hardened. "Then you will say this before the magistrate." Wenceslao looked at him, then at Mariama, and for the first time the refusal did not come. Instead, he said, very quietly, "If I do that, Don Crisoforo Aldana will not be hearing rumor anymore. He will be hearing a man confess himself into the gallows." No one answered him immediately. The dawn in that narrow pass had turned cold and colorless, the kind of light that strips faces of softness and leaves only the truth of them. Wenceslao sat very still on the dark horse, as if he were already feeling the rope of consequences tighten somewhere far ahead. Cosme's anger had not cooled, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the hot urge to strike. It had become something harder, more useful, the refusal to let this confession fall back into silence. "At last," Cosme said, "you have named the right fear." Hilario crossed his arms over his chest and studied the mayordomo with flinty eyes. "Men have walked to judgment for less." "Yes," Wenceslao replied, "and men with land and influence have often watched them go while keeping their own hands clean." Mariama had not moved. Her whole body felt as if it had been hollowed out and filled with wind. Her mother sold away. Severiano dead by arrangement. A tale of blight and cursed birth stitched around an infant so that no one would look too closely at whose face she wore. The cruelty of it was so human, so ordinary in its methods, that for a moment she wished it had been a demon instead. A demon would have been simpler to hate. "And if you speak before the magistrate," she said, "will you speak fully?" Wenceslao met her gaze. "If I speak at all, I will speak beyond saving myself." The horse shifted again. Somewhere higher on the ridge, a little cascade of pebbles rattled loose and came ticking down through the brush. Morning was advancing. The road would not stay empty much longer. Hilario broke the silence first. "Then we stop wasting dark and get off this pass. Don Crisoforo Aldana sits 2 days from here. If we are fortunate, he will still be at his seat and not out measuring some irrigation quarrel." "Fortunate," Mariama repeated faintly, and something sharp flickered in her face at the word. Cosme heard it. "Bad choice," he said softly. A ghost of a breath passed her lips. Not laughter. Close enough to it that he was grateful. They moved again, with Wenceslao now among them, though no one mistook that for trust. Hilario drove. Cosme kept his mule close to the mayordomo's horse. Mariama rode in the cart with the copied parish note folded inside her sleeve. The road unspooled through scrub hills and small settlements where they spoke to almost no one. Wenceslao did not attempt escape. He scarcely spoke unless spoken to. Yet his silence was no longer the guarded silence of a man protecting a household. It was the stunned quiet of a man counting, one by one, the steps that had brought him to the ruin of his own obedience. On the second evening they reached the magistrate's town, larger than San Lorenzo and busier, with a proper square, a customs house, 2 inns, and the low government building where Don Crisoforo received petitions beneath the royal seal. The place smelled of dust, paper, horse leather, and stewing meat from nearby kitchens. Men in better coats moved in and out beneath the colonnade. A pair of constables lounged at the entrance with the bored watchfulness of those accustomed to hearing lies all day. Hilario secured them rooms at a sober inn across the square and then went at once to learn whether the magistrate was in residence. He returned after sunset with his face set in a line that made Mariama's stomach clench. "He is here," Hilario said. "He receives civil matters in the morning, criminal complaints afternoon. We will not appear by chance. We will request audience as a matter touching inheritance, falsified parish entries, and an unlawful death. That will force him to listen longer than if we arrive speaking only of scandal." Cosme nodded. "And Wenceslau?" "I have already told the clerk there is a witness prepared to speak under oath." At that, Wenceslau lifted his head from the chair by the wall where he had been sitting in shadow. "Not to the clerk," he said. "To Aldana himself. I will not have my confession pass first through some boy who sells bits of other men's lives for a cup of wine." Hilario's brow rose a fraction. Pride survives in strange places. "No," Wenceslau said tiredly. "Only this much order. If I am to damn myself, let it be before the proper ears." Late that night, after the square had gone quiet and only the tavern across the way still murmured with drinkers, Mariama stood at the lattice window of her room and looked out at the magistrate's building, lit by 2 wavering lamps. Cosme came to the doorway, but did not enter until she turned. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She looked back at the lamps. "Yes." "So am I." That honesty steadied her more than assurance would have done. At first light, a servant from the magistrate's office knocked at the inn with formal notice. Don Crisoforo Aldana would hear the matter at noon, and because the complaint named the Quintanar family, a mounted messenger had already been dispatched before dawn to summon Don Aurelio and Doña Hortensia to appear as well. At noon, the magistrate's chamber was close with heat, paper dust, and the smell of sealing wax. Don Crisoforo Aldana sat beneath the carved royal arms with 2 clerks at his side, and impatience already in the set of his mouth. He had expected, no doubt, another quarrel over fields, water, or unpaid mules. Instead, he found before him a cloth merchant, an innkeeper, a pale young woman with a village's worth of fear laid over her like a shawl, and a mayordomo from one of the strongest houses in the district asking leave to testify under oath. That changed the room at once. The hearing did not unfold in one clean stroke. Truth rarely does. Hilario presented the copied parish note. Cosme gave the road of events plainly, without ornament. Mariama spoke of the names she had lived under, of Father Anselmo, of Casilda's dying words, of the way Doña Hortensia's fear had always felt too exact for mere superstition. Then Wenceslau stepped forward and, with both hands visible before him as if already surrendering them to judgment, said what no one in that chamber wished to hear, and yet all of them understood would now shape everything that followed. He confessed. He confessed that Severiano had loved Adjua. He confessed that Adjua had borne a child whose existence threatened inheritance. He confessed that the story of blighted crops and dead infants had been spread to make the girl untouchable, ridiculous, fearsome, easier to cast aside than to question. And when the chamber had gone so still that even the scratching of the clerk's pen sounded loud, he confessed the road death too. Don Crisoforo did not interrupt him once. By the time Aurelio Quintanar and Doña Hortensia were brought in under summons, the air had altered from curiosity to scandal. Aurelio came red-faced and furious, indignant less at the charge than at being forced to answer it publicly. Hortensia came pale and rigid, dressed with all the correctness of a woman who had spent years believing appearances could hold back ruin. When she saw Mariama standing there beside the magistrate's table, she stopped as though struck. For the first time in her life, Mariama did not lower her eyes. The inquiry stretched over weeks after that. Records were compared. Eutimio gave his statement. Old servants were found. One muleteer remembered the wrong journey too well. Anselma's rumor gained bones. Even those who wished to protect the Quintanars found fewer and fewer places to stand. In the end, the magistrate issued what no one at Los Remedios had imagined hearing aloud. Mariama was recognized as the daughter of Severiano Quintanar and Adjua, and with that recognition came legal claim to the portion of land and income her father had once meant to set aside. Aurelio yielded because the law had cornered him where pride could not save him. Hortensia yielded in another way. Before the matter was fully done, she withdrew to a convent in Puebla, carrying her rosary and her silence into stone walls where neither would protect her any longer. Wenceslao was taken into custody after his testimony. Yet even there, justice moved with the slow, complicated steps of the world. A confession given freely before authority weighs differently from a crime dragged unwillingly into daylight. What sentence he received belonged to law. What he had already received belonged to memory. As for Mariama, she did not return to Los Remedios to inhabit its grand rooms, nor did she let the great house's name settle on her shoulders like a reward. When the papers were finally put before her, she rested her hand over the place where her mother's crucifix always lay, and said very calmly that she would keep what came from her father's blood, but not the surname that had been used to bury her mother's. "I was not restored by them," she said. "I survived them." So she took the name that had waited in the parish book all those years, like a buried seed waiting for rain. Adjua. In the seasons that followed, she and Cosme built something smaller than all that old greed had fought over, and better. A modest house on a rise beyond the main road, a loom by one window, indigo drying on a line, 2 mules in the shade, a kitchen garden where basil, squash, and chilies pressed close together in dark soil. He still traveled at times with his cloth, though never so far or so long as before. He would come back dusty from the road and find her at the doorway with the afternoon light on her hair, and there would be no need to name what had grown between them. It was in the way he handed over the reins before washing, in the way she set aside work when she heard the cart, in the way both of them had stopped mistaking tenderness for danger. By the first spring after the judgment, the orange saplings they planted behind the house had taken hold. Their leaves were glossy, stubborn, and new. Nothing in them remembered the fear that had once tried to decide who was fit to live beneath the sun. Toward evening, when the breeze came down from the hills, the little crosses of white blossom would shake and release their scent into the yard, and Mariama Adjua would stand still for a moment to breathe it in, as if at last the world around her had ceased asking what omen she carried and had begun, quietly, to make room. If this story stayed with you, leave a word for Mariama below, and if you want another long tale tomorrow night, keep this channel close.